Hello, my name is Terry Irwin, and I'm a professor in the School of Design at Carnegie Mellon University and the director of the Transition Design Institute there. This presentation is an overview of a 6-month research project to understand the perspectives and concerns of stakeholders connected to the problem of a lack of funding for minority entrepreneurs in the US and the UK. This research was commissioned by the Nasdaq Entrepreneurial Center and was carried out by the Transition Design Institute at Carnegie Mellon, who are one of 10 partners researching the many facets of this complex wicked problem. This video describes the second data gathering step we undertook, called mapping stakeholder relations. In it, stakeholder groups told us how the problem of a lack of funding for minority entrepreneurs affected their stakeholder group. Each group described their fears and concerns and hopes and desires connected to the problem. The map that resulted reveals where stakeholders agree and disagree and how they feel about each other. The data gathered in this step resulted in the stakeholder relations map highlighted in the blue box. This step can be found on the Miro board in the third column from the left. The systems map is at the top with the analysis situated directly below it. In the second step of data gathering, mapping stakeholder relations, each group told us about their fears and concerns in the pink talk bubbles, as well as their hopes and desires in the green talk bubbles, both of which are connected to the problem of a lack of funding for minority entrepreneurs. The research team has once again identified high-level themes around which stakeholder responses are clustered on this systems map. We did not create a single aggregated map in this step, and instead kept each of the 4 groups' responses separate in order to see where stakeholders agreed and disagreed. Here you see the hopes and fears map for Black entrepreneurs with responses clustered in boxes under those high-level themes. And shown here is a list of all of the high-level categories of fears and concerns and hopes and desires from all 4 stakeholder groups. Like the aggregated themes from the problem map, this list provides an immediate overview of how the 4 groups feel about the problem and each other. Mapping the relations among stakeholder groups can reveal where groups are at odds with each other, which is often what keeps problems stuck. But it can also reveal areas in which they agree. We often call this the low-hanging fruit in the system. These areas of alignment and agreement are where work can begin immediately, not only to address the problem, but to also build bridges between stakeholder groups that often believe they have little in common or are actually at odds with each other. Directly below the stakeholder relations map is the analysis board in which affinity mapping was conducted. The research team analyzed stakeholder hopes and fears, then looked for areas of alignment around the high-level themes. And as before, representative stakeholder responses are placed in proximity to these high-level themes. And we've repeated the process directly below to affinity map stakeholder hopes and desires. These 2 matrices revealed insights about the stakeholders' relationship to the problem, as well as each other, both of which are necessary in creating systemic solutions. Analysis showed that stakeholder fears and concerns fell into 2 broad categories: fears having to do with how people think and act, and fears related to tangible material issues in one of those 5 sectors from the problem map. So fears about the problem are both material and non-material in nature, which is an important distinction in the formulation of solutions aimed at resolving the problem. And here's why. Fears and concerns in the left-hand column usually lead to fears in the right-hand column. Solutions aimed at addressing the tangible material issues listed in that right-hand column are likely to fail if solutions aimed at changing the mindsets and beliefs that underpin these issues are not implemented either beforehand or at least simultaneously. The affinity mapping methodology was applied in this matrix, where aggregate fears and concerns are listed in the vertical column on the left, and the 4 stakeholder groups are listed on the horizontal axis above. The circles in the matrix denote the degree of importance each stakeholder group placed on a particular category of fears or concerns about the problem of a lack of funding for minority entrepreneurs. Because the sizes of the stakeholder groups varied, the sizes of the circles is relative to the size of the group and is not based upon a mathematical calculation. The matrix also illustrates where fears and concerns are common to all 4 groups and which ones each group feels most strongly about. Analysis showed that a concern with problematic attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that create or exacerbate the problem was shared by every stakeholder group. Systemic oppression, racism, and inequity was a concern shared by 3 of the 4 groups and was the strongest concern voiced by capital allocators and community organizers. We can also see that groups had relatively little to say about political and governance issues, which could represent a lack of knowledge or understanding and or indicate an area where additional research is warranted. In this way, the matrix can be used to help target subsequent or supplemental qualitative and quantitative stakeholder research. Research analysis also contrasted the fears and concerns among the 4 stakeholder groups and revealed that Black entrepreneurs were most concerned with the adverse general effects the lack of funding had on their communities as a whole, while both capital allocators and US community organizers cited systemic oppression as a key concern. Capital allocators also cited problematic funding, lending, hiring practices, and metrics, which was a concern also shared by both US and UK researchers. 3 categories of fears and concerns were shared by all 4 stakeholder groups: problematic attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, systemic racism and oppression, and problematic funding, lending, hiring practices, and metrics. This comports with the feedback loop we saw in the problem map, in which attitudes and behaviors become materialized and formalized in systems and practices within the business and economic sectors. Concerns that were shared by 3 out of 4 stakeholder groups included minorities' lack of access to resources and networks of help, tokenism, and issues related to technology, tools, and data. And these are actually themes that run throughout all 6 data sets and represent clear territories for solutions likely to have broad stakeholder support. Note again that in most cases, we have situated actual stakeholder responses alongside the organizational themes created by the research team. Lower down on the same analysis board, you'll see that we repeated the same exercise for stakeholder hopes and concerns using the affinity mapping approach. However, this section elicited more agreement across the response categories with the 4 groups than did fears and concerns. Here again, we see references to attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors and their manifestation in funding, lending, and hiring practices. All 4 stakeholder groups expressed hopes for paradigmatic change in both these areas and agreed that new attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors connected to minority groups were even more important than new and equitable funding, lending, and hiring practices and metrics. This underscores the necessity for interventions aimed at shifting attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors to underpin material solutions aimed at improving or regulating lending and hiring practices and metrics. In our view, solutions aimed at the latter will likely fail if not scaffolded by the former. Another key insight is that all 4 groups were focused on the hope that new narratives, problem frames, and stories about role models would emerge. As noted before, analyzing stakeholder hopes and desires often reveals concepts for solutions aimed at shifting mindsets and beliefs. In contrasting the hopes and desires among the four groups, we see that Black entrepreneurs and UK capital allocators hope for changes in current attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, and all four groups hope for new and more equitable forms of funding, lending, hiring practices, and metrics. The hopes and desires shared by all four groups were new attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, new equitable funding, lending, hiring practices, and metrics, and new narratives, problem frames, and role models. So it's important to point out that these hopes correlate with stakeholder fears and concerns, as well as issues cited on the problem map. You can begin to see the repetition. But this cross-correlation is what we look for in systems mapping because it reveals and validates the areas in which solutions are likely to have broad stakeholder support. 3 out of 4 stakeholder groups shared a long list of hopes and desires. Better access to education, skills, resources, and networks of help, the positive general effects funding will have on minority communities, the hope that minority entrepreneurship will be seen as a good investment, the positive effects from changes in policy and governance, increased collaboration and networking across stakeholder communities, and equitable representation in positions of power. This is very significant and provides a wealth of ideas for highly targeted solutions. The aggregate list of hopes and desires for all groups fell into the 2 same categories as the problem map: hopes for change in the way people think and act, and hopes to do with changes in tangible material issues, both of which are powerful solution categories, as I'll discuss in the last video. This concludes the 3rd video in this series of research reports. In the next step, stakeholders map the historic evolution of the problem over the course of multiple decades. And historical maps like this are often created with input from both stakeholders and researchers alike. In this case, the research team conducted initial historical research on the problem, and each stakeholder group used it as the departure point for mapping the problem from their group's point of view. These maps reveal insights from the past that can inform solutions in the present. Please access video number 4 in this series called Mapping the Historical Evolution of the Problem to access our findings.